All right, this next lecture is going to be on the lymphatic system, which a lot of people just refer to as the immune system of the body. So, functions of the immune system and or the lymphatic system. So, you notice the third bullet point I have is immune function, which I think we're all well aware of. We'll talk a lot about that throughout this lecture, but the first two are things that you don't commonly associate with the lymphatic system, although they're key roles of the lymphatic system. So, transporting excess fluid back to the bloodstream. So, to put that in perspective, as blood is flowing through the circulations, as you've learned about, due to the blood pressure, some of the fluid, the plasma, is pushed out into the tissues, and you have to have a way to get that plasma, or it's no longer plasma once it's out in the tissues. They just call it interstitial fluid. You have to have a way to get that interstitial fluid back into the bloodstream, and that's one of the things that the lymphatic system does. The other key thing that it does is it transports dietary fats or lipids. And so when we absorb most nutrients, they're absorbed into the blood and go straight to the liver. Well, fats are a little bit different. Fats are absorbed into these little structures called lacteals, which are found throughout the intestines. And they are part of the immune system, are part of the lymphatic system. So lacteals are lymphatic structures that absorb fats. And then overall, the immune function that we've mentioned. All right, so what the lymphatic system looks like, it's several organs, and they're all connected by these vessels. So we have lymph vessels. There's different classifications of these lymph vessels. We have lymphatic capillaries, lymphatic vessels, lymphatic trunks, and lymphatic ducts. And we'll kind of run through them in that order. And then the lymph itself is just the fluid inside those vessels. So like we said, it's like excess interstitial fluid, and it has some stuff dissolved in it, along with several immune-related cells like T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, which we'll talk more about. So starting at the smallest vessels, we have lymphatic capillaries. And you can see from this picture here that the lymphatic capillaries are in green, and the normal, or I should say the systemic circulation vessels are shown in red and blue. So this would be a systemic artery. This is systemic vein. Here's your normal capillary bed. So you can see these lymphatic capillaries are intertwined with the normal capillaries of the cardiovascular system. So right next to them. And they're single cell layers, so we call it endothelium. If you look at how the cells, especially right here, how the cells kind of overlap, this allows that interstitial fluid to get into the lymphatic system. So the cells overlap, and you have like these one-way flaps that allow interstitial fluid to get into the lymphatic system, but the lymph cannot get out. And then the other thing, there's valves on these lymphatic capillaries. This is a common thing in the lymphatic system to have valves. Similar to veins, they don't have a lot of pressure, so to prevent the lymph from backing up, they have these one-way valves throughout. And so in the microscope slide, you can see right here, that's showing one of the valves. So the next layer, as the vessels get bigger, are just called lymphatic vessels. These are really similar to veins. As you can see, there's valves in them. Many of them connect to lymph nodes. We'll talk about that before this is over. And just for right now, terminology-wise, afferent lymphatic vessels bring lymph towards the lymph node. Efferent vessels carry it away from the lymph node. So after the vessels, we have lymphatic trunks, and there's several of these, but these are getting bigger. And these are the main ones that you need to be familiar with. Notice that, based on their names, you can kind of tell where they are. You get jugular, subclavian, bronchomediastinal. Just based on the names, you should kind of have an idea where they are. Intestinal and lumbar. And so all of these have a left and a right, with the exception of the intestinal trunk. So you do not necessarily need to identify these, but just kind of know the major ones. Like if we have a right and a left, or we do not have a right and a left. All right, and then we have the biggest of the lymphatic vessels, lymphatic ducts, and there's two. So this is where we need to talk some specifics. So the right lymphatic duct, which you can see right here, it kind of collects all the lymph that's draining from the right side of the head, the right side of the neck, the right arm, and the right side of the chest. All the lymphatic, or the lymph in that area, is coming in, it's going to eventually drain into the right lymphatic duct. And this is where the lymph gets back into the bloodstream. So the right lymphatic duct empties into where the junction of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein are. So right at this junction right here. And that's basically how you get that fluid back into the bloodstream. The other duct is the thoracic duct. So this is much bigger. It's going to collect, you can see it right here, it's labeled right here. It collects lymph from everywhere else. So that would be left side of the head, left side of the neck, left side of the torso, left arm, and anything below the chest. So all that lymph is coming back to the thoracic duct. And it's going to empty into the bloodstream on the other side near the left subclavian and the left jugular vein where they meet up. So in addition to that, there's a couple other little things I just wanted to point out. This little expanded region right here called cisternae chyli is just an expanded region because it's collecting the lymph from all of this area in here, from the intestinal and then lumbar trunks. So it's just in the little expanded region of the thoracic duct. And this picture kind of sums up what we talked about. So everything here is everything drained by, the area is drained by the right lymphatic duct. Everything else drained by is coming from the left, obviously the thoracic duct. So everything in dark green is the area drained by the right lymphatic duct. Everything in green, area drained by the thoracic duct. All right, so that's it about the vessels. Let's talk about the cells. So the major lymphatic cells are going to be macrophages, which just phagocytize things. They're derived from monocytes. Dendritic cells, which tear down or break down antigens or intruders that get into the body. So when we talk about the lymphatic system, antigens are bad things like viruses or bacteria that could get in the body. And so your body's trying to fight them off. So dendritic cells are found in lymph nodes, and they target antigens. And then lymphocytes. These get very complex, but there's three major types: T lymphocyte, B lymphocyte, and natural killer cells. So we had mentioned these when we were talking about the blood, but now we're going to go into some details on what they actually do. All right, so starting with T lymphocytes, there's different types. The one type is called helper T lymphocytes, and they have a type of receptor called CD4. Not overly important, but that's the type of receptor that's on their surface. And these helper T lymphocytes are called helper T because they oversee the immune response. They help out. They don't really get their hands dirty too much. So what they do is basically activate other cells to come in and do the dirty work. So they do this by secreting chemicals called cytokines. And it's kind of like a message that activates all these other cells. So the helper T lymphocytes activate other cells and allow them to come in and have the immune response. But the helper T themselves don't do a lot directly. So then we have cytotoxic T, different type of receptor on the surface. These are one of the cells activated by the helper T, and these directly target antigens and foreign substances that get in the body that could be harmful. So these are the cells that get their hands dirty and go in and usually release chemicals that would break down or tear up a dangerous cell that has gotten into the body. Then we have B lymphocytes. These are also activated by the helper T. When they're activated, they differentiate either into plasma cells or another cell called a memory B lymphocyte. So if you remember, plasma cells secrete antibodies. So once the plasma cells start producing antibodies, those antibodies go out and try to target the antigens, the harmful things that are in the body. And then the memory B lymphocytes hang around and just kind of remember what antigens have gotten to the body. So if that same antigen ever comes back, you'll have a more coordinated response and a quicker response to get rid of it. Very similar to the concept of getting the flu shot. So you expose your body to this virus, just a mild form of it, and you build up the ability to recognize it. So these memory B lymphocytes, if they see it again, they can target it really quick and get rid of it. And so here's an idea of what's going on here. So here's your helper T lymphocyte. It activates the B lymphocyte. The B lymphocyte differentiates into these plasma cells or memory B lymphocytes. The plasma cells secrete antibodies that go out and target the antigens. And then the memory B lymphocytes hang around, and if that antigen ever comes back, you have a more powerful response because it remembers that antigen. Right, these natural killer cells, very less specific than the other two, but different type of receptor, CD16 for what it's worth, and they just kind of go after everything. So if there's any antigen in the body, the natural killer cells have this just overall response that goes after it. Sometimes this is not great, even though they're trying to get rid of a certain antigen. Oftentimes they just destroy a lot of stuff. So sometimes they destroy good cells as well as bad cells. And this is one of the reasons you might start to get like a sore throat when you get sick, because these natural killer cells are just trying to destroy everything. And so they actually destroy some of the throat cells, and that obviously is not the most pleasant thing. But their goal is to get rid of the harmful substance. But again, they're just not as specific as some of the other cells that we've talked about. All right, and then we have the structures. So we'll talk about the structures and organs. So we have lymphatic nodules. Lymphatic nodules are just patches of lymphatic tissue. So commonly it's found on mucosa. So we'll talk about this germinal center concept with the lymph node, but in the middle areas of a lymphatic nodule, you have this area called the germinal center. But here's the important thing from this slide. These lymphatic nodules get together to form what's called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. And this is found in areas of the body that have like a lining. So the GI tract in particular, the respiratory tract, even the urinary tract. So one great example of this is in the small intestine. We have these areas called Peyer's patches, and that's what's shown here. And these are just patches of immune tissue. It's mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, and it's specifically found in the ileum of the small intestine. And if you don't know what the ileum of the small intestine is yet, we'll talk more about that with the digestive system. Our next lymphatic structure, tonsils. There's 3 pairs: pharyngeal, found here, back of the top of the throat, palatine, so back of the oral cavity, and then lingual under the tongue. And again, this is a microscope slide of tonsils, and this is pretty much what they look like. And again, they're just lymphatic tissue to help fight off anything that could be harmful going into your mouth or nasal cavity. All right, the thymus, which we've talked about before, it's an organ that sits on the front of the heart, and it assists in the development of T lymphocytes. We talked a little bit about this with the endocrine system, but again, it just assists in T lymphocyte development by secreting hormones. So thought to be very important in children, but as we get to become adults, less and less of a role. So it tends to atrophy as you get older. But again, its role assists in T lymphocyte development. All right, so here's our lymph nodes that we introduced earlier. And I want to point out a couple things. So the lymph nodes are found along lymphatic vessels. And so the afferent vessels bring lymph towards the lymph node. The efferent vessels bring lymph away. And that's the first thing I want you to notice is there's a lot more afferent vessels than efferent. The reason being, since you only have like really one way out, but you have all these ways in, it tends to slow down the flow of lymph in the lymph node, and that allows the lymph node to kind of filter out the lymph and target any dangerous cells that might be in there. All right, so given that there's different areas, 2 big areas, maybe 3, we wouldn't break it into 3, but all this area out here is called the cortex of the lymph node. Everything in here is called the medulla. So inside medulla, outside cortex. In addition to that, and this is not typed on this slide, but it came up earlier, these little white spots, they're called germinal centers. So germinal centers, and it's actually written right here. So germinal center. And the cells tend to differ depending on what part of the lymph node you're in. So in the medulla, we have lots of macrophages. In the cortex in general, we have lots of T lymphocytes. And in the germinal centers, we have lots of B lymphocytes. So B lymphocytes, germinal center, cortex, T lymphocytes, medulla, macrophages. And then these little kind of vessels going through the lymph node to allow it to let the lymph to flow, these are called lymphatic sinuses. And lastly, we just tend to get clusters of these lymph nodes in certain regions, axillary, so your armpit has a lot of this, inguinal, your groin area has a lot of lymph nodes, and then cervical, the neck area, you get lots of lymph nodes. And this is what sometimes a clinician will feel to see if they're swollen if you're sick. All right, then we have the spleen. So the spleen is the largest lymphatic organ. It's found in the left upper quadrant, surrounded by connective tissue, has a big artery going into it, big vein leaving it. And inside it, you get these areas called pulp. So you get these little units. So you have white pulp surrounded by red pulp. So the white pulp is associated with the arterial blood as it's coming in. The red pulp is associated with that venous blood as it's leaving. So I'm not overly concerned with all this other stuff other than that. So white pulp is associated with arterial blood, red pulp associated with venous blood leaving. And the big thing is the spleen is filtering the blood. This is different from lymph nodes. So lymph nodes are filtering the lymph, whereas the spleen is actually filtering the blood. But similar to a lymph node, it has all these lymphatic cells in it. And then I added this extra slide that you can, because it's another organ. I usually talk about this organ with the digestive system, but it is a lymphatic organ, so I put it in here also. So the appendix is this little structure right here, and it has an immune function. It basically hangs off the beginning of the large intestine, which is called the cecum, and it has an immune function, so it helps filter out anything that could be harmful and target anything harmful that could go into the intestines.